Good morning, church. Today I'm reading 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 1 to 2. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother's name was Jedediah, daughter of Adiah. She was from Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or the left.
Well, thanks so much for that, Christian. Thanks for reading that. I thought maybe before we jump into it, I might just say a prayer. So if you could just bow your heads with me as I pray. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for this Sabbath day, for bringing us through another week. We come before you, carrying the burdens of the week. For some, it's been a blessing. It's been a week of happiness and of joy, and for others it's been a challenge, a week of frustration and of stress and of anger and of guilt and shame, and whatever it is that we're bringing before you today, God, I pray that you will just take it, and that you will help us to focus on you throughout this time. I pray that you be with me as I just share a little bit of my story and of the story of mental health and your church. May you speak through me. I pray all these things in your name. Amen. So I might just see if I can share screen. Alrighty, hopefully that's working. I have preached a few times before, but never via Zoom. So this is all a bit of a new thing for me. Like I said, my name's Scott. I am a psychologist, so I'm not a pastor. Although, like Daniel said, I do have some pastoral heritage. My grandfather's a pastor, and two of my uncles are pastors as well. Does that mean that I'm a good preacher? I don't know, probably not. But I thought that given today's topic, which is looking at Christianity and mental health, it's something that I'm passionate about. And so hopefully, even if I fumble through words and through points, hopefully you'll be able to draw out the core message, and that God will be able to speak through me as we go through it. So, I mean, when I tell people that I'm a psychologist, often they ask me, well, why did you want to become a psychologist? And I guess that's a good question. Why would anyone want to become a psychologist? And for me, I actually didn't always want to be a psychologist. In fact, when I was younger, I wanted to be an engineer, probably up near around the age of 10, of year 10. I thought, yeah, engineering's cool. You build things, you like pull things apart, that type of stuff. But then I realized that I actually liked people. And in my head at that time, I thought, well, probably engineering isn't best for me if I want to be working with people. And so I thought, well, what could I do that is with people? And I kind of thought about it for a while, and then eventually decided psychology might be a good idea. And I made that choice around year 11. So what were some of those reasons that I picked psychology? Well, I mean, the people thing is number one. Number two is I was probably a bit of a nosy kid when I was young. Always wanted to know people's goss and that type of thing. So maybe that was part of it. Another bit was my dad, typical kind of Asian dad, wanted me to do medicine, which at the time I was a bit of a rebellious teenager. And so I said, nah, stuff you, Dad. I'm not doing medicine. I'm going to study psychology, the epitome of rebellion, right? But probably the thing that really pushed me into psychology was a story. And it was a story about a young girl. So it was a story about this young girl who had just been brought into the world, and she was starting to explore all the wonderful different experiences of life. She'd begun to develop awareness of herself and of the world around her. She was exploring all of her five senses. She was looking at all of these wonderful things, hearing all the wonderful things in the world, coming into touch and smell and taste, and she was really just mesmerized by her sense of self and where that stopped and where the outside world kind of started. She was really just interested in the way that she could control her body, her limbs, her fingers, and all of these things. And then she soon learned after that she wasn't alone in the world. Her sense of self wasn't to develop in a vacuum, but rather it was developed in relationship. She learned about how others could provide a sense of safety, of joy, of comfort. But at about this time, something started to go wrong. What was it exactly that marked that point of change? I can't really say for sure. Perhaps it was exposure to lies about herself, lies about the world around her, lies about her relationship with others. Perhaps it was the internalization of those lies and buying into them, believing them. Or perhaps it was the actions that she took in response to these lies. I'm not sure. Perhaps it was something else entirely different, but suddenly this young girl was hit with a wave of new experiences. She couldn't quite put a label to these experiences at the time, but she felt that thumping in her chest, that feeling she would later recognize as fear. She felt the pulsing in her muscles, and later she would learn to label that as anger. She felt that sunken pit in her stomach, a feeling that she would become quite familiar with over time, that feeling of shame. Along with these experiences came a flood of thoughts. What have I done? Why do I feel so awful? How can I make this pain go away? I can't let anyone see me like this. Surely they'll know what I've done. They'll see me as broken. I have to escape. I have to cover up. I have to hide. I can't let anyone see my guilt, my shame, my nakedness. And so that's what she did. She took all the aspects of herself that she perceived as unacceptable, unlovable, and she buried them deep down into the center of her being. And she felt a little bit better for a time. Now she could return to her old relationships as if nothing had happened, had changed. And as she grew, she continued to take any painful, shameful emotions and hide them deep down inside of herself, whilst putting up walls, layer and layer after layer of walls, so that people would only see what she wanted them to see. She could live and smile and survive in life, whilst all the while knowing that if anyone knew who I really was deep down inside, if anyone knew the real me, they would just reject me. And at the time when I was deciding my career, how I was going to spend my hours in my day over the next 40 years or so, I came across this story. And it moved me. I felt pain for this young girl, and I felt an overwhelming desire to help her. So who was this young girl in the story? Well, if I'm honest, this story is probably about me. And I'm guessing that if you open yourself up to reflect on it, it's probably a story about you as well. Not every person will go on to develop a mental health disorder as defined by the American Psychiatric Association, but every person can relate with feelings of shame, of fear, disgust, anger, heartbreak. Every person can resonate with what it's like to internalize the lies that we hear. Lies that we hear from our family members, our peers at school, the media, our coaches, and even our church leaders. I'm guessing that every person has put up walls in an attempt to hide parts of our real selves from others. this story was one that I heard over and over, both directly and indirectly, as I navigated my way through my early childhood and adolescent life. And this story was a big factor that came into why I decided to become a psychologist. So what did I learn from the story? What did it teach me? Well, it taught me a few things. And the first one is that suffering is real. There's a lot of pain in this world. The second one is that people naturally feel ashamed of their suffering and will try to hide it. That's a really normal human experience. The third one is that this will happen to even those who are in the church. And then the last one was that the amount of support that's available for those that are suffering within the church is not always adequate. In fact, often it's not adequate. And so this story and those things that I learned really influenced me and influenced the direction that I wanted to take my life. Well, I mean, that and also the stuff you dad, I'm not studying medicine type of attitude that comes with being a rebellious teenager. So today I feel really glad and I feel really blessed to be able to speak about mental health today, because it's something that I'm really passionate about. And I'm also passionate about the way that it intersects with Christianity. I wanted to be clear and say that I don't have all the answers. I probably won't be able to provide all the answers. The topic of mental health in Christianity is so broad and it covers so many different questions. I mean, just writing this talk, I struggled a lot with trying to figure out what to say, which of these questions I should try to tackle. You know, there's questions like, if God can heal the sick, why doesn't he heal me from my depression or from my anxiety or from my history of trauma? Or there's questions like, why do I get anxious and depressed even though I believe in God? Is my faith not strong enough? Or questions like, how am I supposed to show people Jesus through my life when I'm struggling so much to even get out of bed on most days? And all of these questions are really important. You know, these are just a few of the really important questions surrounding Christianity and mental health. And each one could probably have their own lengthy sermon or sermon series. But with prayer and thought, and knowing that I only had a few minutes to speak with you today, I thought that I would focus on a bit of a bigger picture and really just highlight those 4 main points that I've talked about here. The suffering is real. People will naturally feel ashamed of their suffering and try to hide it. This is happening in the church, and the support that we have is not really adequate at the moment. And then at the end, I thought maybe I could share a 5th piece of information, a way forward, a way that we as a church and as Christians can provide hope in a world of great challenge. So before I kind of go on, I did want to just mention that you know, I don't know where people are sitting at as they listen to this, and if anyone is really in need of support, there's a few places that I'd recommend you reaching out to. The first one is Lifeline and Beyond Blue, which are just some professional supports that might be available. If you do feel like you need to talk to someone more in-depthly, speak to your doctor about getting a referral for perhaps seeing a psychologist, or if you'd like, we've got the email address for Wallara Church. We can send through any concerns or questions that come up. And so I've opened with this bit of a story just to tug at your heartstrings a little bit. But in reality, I'm more of a statistics kind of guy. But I guess there's a bit of a saying that 1 death is a tragedy, but 1,000 deaths is a statistic. And so that's why I thought opening with something that tugs at someone's heartstrings might be best. But I did want to kind of highlight some of the really surprising statistics about mental health in Australia. And I hope it doesn't come across a bit too much of a lecture, so I'll try and skip through this bit as quickly as possible. But I thought I would just highlight, well, what is a mental health disorder? And what does that actually mean? Because that's not always clear for people. And The reality is that pain is a part of life. It's a part of reality. It's human and it's normal to experience pain in this world that we're in. But whilst everyone does experience pain, not everyone goes on to experience a mental health disorder. And the World Health Organization kind of states that a mental health disorder is when someone's state of mental well-being negatively impacts on their ability to realize their potential, to cope with normal stress of life, and their overall quality of life. So the key things when you're trying to differentiate between kind of normal pain and a mental health disorder is to say, is the suffering that someone's experiencing, is it longer than usual? Does it stretch out for days and weeks and months and potentially years? Or is it a response to immediate circumstances? The second one, is it more distressing? Does it cause significantly more distress for someone than what other people may experience? And then the last one, and probably the most important one, is does it impact on their quality of life? Does it actually stop them from doing the things they'd like to do or that they feel like they should be doing? And that's what we talk about when we talk about a mental health disorder. Now, with that, there's quite a few, I guess, myths or misunderstandings about what it means to have a mental health disorder. And one view that sometimes I hear from people is that only weak people, or maybe only people who've gone through really traumatic experiences will experience a mental health disorder. So I wanted to go through a few statistics, and I thought maybe I'd kind of ask you guys the question, and then you can see what your own expectations are about some of these stats. So the first one is looking at what percentage of people will experience a mental health disorder in their lifetime in Australia. You know, think of a number maybe in your head, percentage. It's 45%. So almost 1 in 2 people will experience a mental health disorder in their lifetime. Now, a life is pretty long, you know, over the course of maybe 70, 80 years. Okay, maybe someone will have a mental health disorder come up for them. What about more recently, like in the past 12 months? What percentage of people do you think will have experienced a mental health disorder in the past 12 months? So think of a number, 20%. So 1 in 5 people in the past 12 months will have experienced a mental health disorder. And I'm guessing with COVID, that number's probably gone up a little bit. So what about some of the really more intense forms of emotion and the really intense forms of mental health disorders? And this is where we might start to talk about something like having thoughts about taking one's own life. So what percentage of people do you think have had serious thoughts about taking one's own life? 13%. So about 1 in 8 people reported that they've had serious thoughts about suicide. So next I wanted to look at, well, where does the mental health burden rank in terms of its impact on society in Australia amongst all the different types of diseases? And when we look at the burden of disease for mental health in Australia, it sits at 3rd. And it's actually quite close to cardiovascular disease. And one of the most, I guess, eye-opening statistics for me when I was going through my studies was to learn that suicide is the leading cause of death. It ranks number 1 for people aged 15 to 24 years old. And so what does this tell us about mental health? Well, it really is just emphasizing that first point that I said. Pain is real. Suffering is real, and it's all around us. Chances are that you have personally experienced a period of mental health disorder or mental illness throughout your life, and it's pretty likely that you may have experienced one in the past 12 months. If you haven't personally, well, I can guarantee you that someone close to you has. whether a close friend or family member, everyone has been impacted by mental health and a mental health illness. Now, the next point is that people will naturally be ashamed and they'll try to cover up when they're experiencing suffering. And when we look at the rate of people who are actually willing to seek help for the mental health disorder, it's pretty low. We're looking at 18 to 34%. So about a quarter of people who meet criteria for a mental health disorder actually go on to seek help. And why is that? You know, what's stopping them from seeking help? And some of those key factors are the stigma that comes with having a mental health problem. In fact, it's probably the most cited reason for what stops people from seeking help. And it kind of makes sense, right? It's normal to try and avoid pain. When we experience physical pain, we try to avoid that thing that caused us that. If you pop your hand on a hot stove, you want to pull back, you want to escape. And the thing is that emotional pain actually operates on a very similar network to physical pain. And so we respond in a similar way. We try to avoid things that cause us that emotional pain. And being vulnerable, being open, is an emotionally painful experience. Often people learn to push these emotions away from young. They learn to hide them, to escape from them. And often our response is to try to cover up. And this often leads to a culture of hiding emotional suffering rather than reaching out. So we know that mental health is a real problem, and we know that there's significant stigma around it, and we know that help seeking is relatively low. So what about in the church then? Are the statistics any different? You know, how does Christianity intersect with mental health? So let's have a look at the statistics about mental health in the Adventist church. And you can probably see it on the screen there. Unfortunately, I did a bit of a search in preparation for this talk, and I couldn't find any statistics looking at mental health in the church, in the Adventist church. And it's possible that there is some research out there addressing this topic, but I couldn't find it. Admittedly, I did only spend about 30 minutes trying to research it. But from what I could find, we have very little quality empirical research indicating or dedicated to understanding mental health in the church. So if we want to understand this intersection between Christianity and mental health, what can we turn to? And I guess the first place is probably to look back to what I opened with, which is stories and anecdotes. I personally know many people that have suffered mental health illnesses in the church. And I know that some of these people, while suffering, have still had some of the strongest faith that I've ever seen. So from my own experience, I can attest to the fact that suffering is real in the church, and there's also significant stigma and pressure to cover up this suffering from those that are in the church as well. I guess another place we can turn to is the Bible, and we can turn to Bible characters. So which of the Bible characters that we learn about, these heroes, did not express significant suffering throughout their lives? Some of the verses that come to mind for me just reflect a really intense and chronic emotional state that would be hard to believe that they didn't suffer with a mental health disorder. For example, if you read through the Psalms and you read through a lot of the writings of David, you can see such raw emotion. Same with Jeremiah. You can see just these woes, and it's almost as if depression is poured out on the page. I think of someone like Elijah when he was running from Mount Carmel, and he was just in the grips of fear and anxiety. Or you think of Jonah's expression. You know, he said outright that he would rather die than live at one point. So I wish that I could point to some of the convincing statistics about mental health in the church, but couldn't find it. Yet these anecdotes and these biblical examples do, for me, provide a convincing argument that mental health problems are prevalent in the church. The other thing that we do have a fair bit of research on is looking at who leaves the church and for what reason. And I wanted to be clear, mental health disorders affect people across all ages. But I wanted to focus in particular on young people, because often it's the young people that are bringing the new culture through and bringing through changes. And we know that 6 out of 10 young people leave the church. So 60% of people leave the church. And why is that? Well, there's probably tons of different reasons, but one thing that stands out to me is that it's possible that some of the key concerns that young people have are not being addressed fully by us in the church. And what are some of those concerns? Well, the Mission Australia does a youth survey every year, and they look at what are the top things that young people are concerned about. And from last year, the top 3 was coping with stress, mental health, and body image. And I mean, all of those things are pretty much very similar. They deal with mental health and mental well-being. And so I wonder if part of the reason, and I'm not saying this is the whole reason, but part of the reason that young people are not staying in church is because we're not fully addressing the key things, the main concerns that they are dealing with. So I've kind of bored you now to death with research and statistics, but I hope that I've been able to highlight these really key challenges that we're faced with as a church. Suffering is real. It's normal for people to try and hide it and feel ashamed of that suffering. And these things happen regardless of whether you're in the church or not. And at the moment, we don't have enough support for those who are suffering in the church. So where do we go from here? If there's a 5th point, what does that look like? What is the way forward? And there's a lot of things that we as Christians can do to help and provide hope for people that are going through really challenging times. I think of pretty much every sermon that we have points to finding hope and peace in Christ. And so, I didn't want to spend too much time focusing on that because I think we preach about that quite a lot. The other thing that we have as Adventists is a pretty strong health message. And we try to focus on holistic health, not just on physical health, but on mental well-being as well. And I know that we have, for example, the Depression Recovery Program, which has been run through our church, a number of times, and the Forgive to Live program is also available. And these are all really awesome messages. And so again, I didn't want to spend too much time focusing on that because I know that those aspects are already there. Instead, I kind of wanted to focus, like I said, on a little bit of a bigger picture around how do we actually change the culture and change the attitude towards mental health in our church. And so I wanted to turn to the Bible. And you may think, oh, finally, he's getting to the Bible. And I wanted to kind of go through just a couple of stories in 1st and 2nd Kings. And for me, about that same time when I started to decide to become a psychologist, I was reading through some of the Old Testament, and I was reading through the stories of the kings and the kings of the nations of Israel and Judah. And pretty much the story starts in 1 Kings chapter 12, where we see that King Solomon dies and the nation of Israel goes through a split. So we see a split between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And in particular, I wanted to focus on the kingdom of Judah because whilst I really love at times to study on like character studies and understand the psychology of different characters, sometimes you can also get a lot of interesting points from zooming out and taking a big picture understanding of what's happening. And so I wanted to look at, rather than a specific king in Judah, rather to look at what are some of the trends, what are some of the patterns over time. And I remember just reading through Kings, and I just remember that after each king was introduced, they had a phrase attached to them. And it pretty much said either the king, they did evil, or they did right in the eyes of the Lord. So here's a list of the kings, and you can see there's a whole bunch there, the kings of Judah. And like I said, some of them did right in the sight of the Lord, and others did evil in the sight of the Lord. And we can kind of see that there's not a great balance. There's a lot more evil happening than a lot of the good happening. And so what was the difference between those who did evil and those who did right? And that's a fairly simple question that most of us here should be able to kind of get. And to do so, maybe we can compare two of the kings. So if we look on the left side, if we look at King Abijah, or however you pronounce that, if you have your Bibles, just turn with me in 1 Kings 15, verse 1. And we're going to read through. In the 18th year of the reign of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Abijah became king of Judah. And Abijah is also called Abijam, depending on the manuscript that you're reading. So he reigned in Jerusalem for 3 years. His mother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. He committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his forefather, had been. So we can see, that's an example of one that did evil. Now, we can flip to, maybe if we look at Josiah. So 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 1, if we want to flip there. And this is the scripture reading that Christian read for us, where it says, Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 31 years. His mother's name was Jedediah, daughter of Adiah, and she was from Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning to the left or to the right. And so we can see this contrast between the two, where one is loyal to God, Josiah is loyal to God, and the other is not loyal to God. And that's what we see with all of these kings on the right here: Asa, Jehoshaphat, Uzziah, Jotham, Hezekiah, Josiah. All of them, they are loyal to God. But this is where things kind of start to get interesting, because when we actually read through the good kings, we can actually differentiate them even further. And one example is if we look at the story of Jehoshaphat. So if you turn to 1 Kings 22, verse 41, we can see the story of King Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat, son of Asa, became king of Judah in the 4th year of Ahab, king of Israel. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 25 years. His mother's name was Azubah, daughter of Shili. In everything, he followed the ways of his father Asa and did not stray from them. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And then this verse here is where it gets interesting, where it says, the high places, however, were not removed, and the people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. And when we read through these stories of the good kings, we can actually see that some of them went a step further and they destroyed these things called high places. So some of them did, Hezekiah and Josiah, but then others did not. For example, Jehoshaphat, who we just read, but also Asa, Uzziah, and Jotham. And so what were these high places? Well, these were the places of worship that were typically used to worship foreign gods. They were largely set up by Solomon to allow his wives to have places to worship. And the thing that I found really interesting reading this was that someone can be loyal to God, someone can still be considered to do right in his eyes, but at the same time still have these high places in their life. And so, I mean, what does it mean to actually remove these high places? And we can kind of look at the decree of why we should be removing them. And that's found in the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And in verse 4, it says, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love and keep my commandments." So here it's talking about how when we worship these other gods, when we get caught up in these other things, then those curses, or sometimes those blessings, will be passed down from generation to generation. And for me, reading this, it was a bit of a challenge. And honestly, it still is a bit of a challenge for me to understand what this means from a theological standpoint. Like, how is it fair that God inflicts judgment upon someone for something that their parents did, or shows mercy to someone for something that their parents did? And like I said, I don't fully understand this, but when I think of some really key concepts in psychology, it does help me to understand at least a portion of it. And so I did want to give you a bit of a crash course on some of the psychology theory. So pretty much for a long time in the schools of psychology, the main focus was on something called behaviorism, which pretty much looked at behaviors as being a result of reinforcement and punishment. It came out of the work of some famous researchers named Skinner and Pavlov, that you may have also heard of. And they looked at a lot of animal models, looking at how if you reinforce a behavior, then it'll be more likely to happen. And if you punish a behavior, it'll be less likely to happen. But around the mid-19th century, another element was adopted. And it was kind of championed by a very famous psychologist named Bandura. And he developed something called social cognitive theory. And his work looked at how people didn't just learn from punishment and reinforcement in their own life, but they actually learned through observation of others. And they experienced social interactions, and that impacted on them. And there was quite a famous experiment with these Bobo dolls where the researchers would go in and they would act aggressively with these dolls. And then later the kids would go in, and having watched how the researcher acted with them, the kid would act with them in the same way. So if they acted aggressively, the kid would also act aggressively. If they acted kindly, then the kid would act kindly. And this was quite interesting because it talked about how people learn from those that they look up to. They learn from others. And the thing that stands out to me with this research, as well as with what we read, is that a really key thing in all of these texts was talking about how each king followed in the path of their father. And sometimes they would follow in the path of their father for evil, but other times they would follow in the path of their father for good. And to me, a really key thing is that the high places in our life that we hold on to, they can get passed down from generation to generation. And so here's something that Ellen White talks about. It is inevitable that children should suffer from the consequences of parental wrongdoings. They are not punished for the parents' guilt, except that they participate in their sins. It is usually the case, however, that children walk in the steps of their parents. By inheritance and example, the sons become partakers of their father's sins. Wrong tendencies, perverted appetites, and debased morals, as well as physical disease and degeneracy. These are transmitted as a legacy from father to the third and fourth generation. And so these high places, they get passed down. And I mean, in reality, these high places could stand for a lot of things. Literally speaking, they stand for idols. But when I read through these verses, I can't help but think what it might mean for mental health. Perhaps one of the key undealt with high places in our lives, in our church, is the culture of stigmatization that we have regarding mental health. Perhaps a high place in our church could be the belief that you shouldn't experience depression or anxiety if you're a Christian, or perhaps the belief that if you have a mental health disorder, that means that you don't have enough faith. Or perhaps it's the belief that I have to deal with my mental health problems on my own and shouldn't burden them on anyone else. All of these challenges are sitting in our culture, in our church, and they're both in plain view and they're also ignored. And what I see is that if these high places go unaddressed, we will just continue to pass down from generation to generation. And I think that for me, a church that is looking to tear down high places may look like one that is willing to have open discussions about mental health in leadership, as well as in the community. So what is it that stops us from doing this? And so this is just highlighting that fact. The God that you serve will likely become the God of those that look up, who look up to you. And the thing is that, I don't know about you, but for me, one of the big things that stops me from sharing about my own experiences is a few things. I mean, the first one is that there's embarrassment about the fact that I feel like I haven't dealt with things in my own life. Maybe if I feel like I'm still struggling with depression or with anxiety, I won't have anything useful to pass on. And the second part is about the embarrassment that might come with sharing about that publicly. How will other people respond? Will they reject me? And those types of things. And I guess the challenge is that mental health problems aren't new things. They've been around for years and years. And my bet is that if you are still sitting in the church, and if you've made it to still sit in the church despite struggling with mental health problems, then chances are you do have something that's really important to share. If you're sitting here today, online, obviously, then that means that you've somehow developed ways of coping and integrating your understanding of mental health with your faith. And so if you're feeling unsure about that, I want to just encourage you to reach out. So how can we as a church become at the forefront of tearing down these high places and digging into addressing mental health as a whole? And for me, one of the things that stands out is that when I'm working with someone as a psychologist and I'm coming to the end of our work together, one thing that we do is we make a safety plan. And the first thing that we talk about on that safety plan is saying, if you're in trouble, if you're distressed, who can you get support from? And one of the most painful things for me is when someone says, I don't really have anyone. I've pushed them all away, or they've dropped me like a ton of bricks. And that's a huge challenge because social support is one of the strongest protective factors we have against mental illness. And whenever someone says that, my mind always goes to maybe if this person came to my church, or maybe our church could provide support for that person. And it's one of those challenges because when someone is going through mental illness, they do become difficult to hang out with. They won't always be fun or charming or easy to hang out with. They might be angry or lacking motivation. They might be worrying all the time. And it's easy for us to try and say, maybe it's better to not have that person in our church, or maybe it's better for me to focus on my own friends or the people that I get along with better. But the thing is that those are the times when people are in need the most. So I just want to wrap up by bringing us back to the story of the young girl that we talked about. She'd been beginning to discover health. She was finding her sense of self through her senses, coming to understand the world around her in relationship. But while she was vulnerable, she bought into some lies. These were lies about herself and about the world and about her relationship with others. And in response to that, this girl, she did something that she shouldn't have. And instantly, this young girl, she was flooded by these emotions. the ones we talked about, the fear, the anger, the shame, the guilt. And her mind became full of thoughts. What have I done? Why do I feel so awful? How can I make this pain go away? I can't let anyone see me like this. Surely they'll know that what I've done, and they'll see me as broken. I have to escape. I have to cover up. I have to hide. I can't let anyone see my guilt, my nakedness, my shame. And so that's what she did. When she saw that she was naked, she ran and she hid in the garden, and she desperately tried to cover herself up. She gathered up some leaves that she'd found fallen on the ground, and she tried to cover, trembling in fear that anyone would see her for who she was. But at that time, the most amazing thing happened. Two of my most favorite words in the Bible are these two words, but God. You see, the girl, she was naked, she was ashamed, she was terrified, she was guilty, but God came looking for her. And if you want to read the story, you can. It's in Genesis chapter 3. Because God knew exactly who Eve was. He saw through all the walls that she was trying to put up and what she'd done. But when he could see all of that, he chose not to give up on her. He didn't accuse her. He didn't point out her nakedness and shame. He came looking for her, and he just asked a question: where are you? And so if you're feeling like Eve, like that young girl, you're feeling overwhelmed by these emotions of shame and guilt and fear, and all you want to do is cover up and hide and escape, God is coming to look for you. He came down to this world as Emmanuel, God with us. He came to share in your pain and to take it upon himself. In Isaiah 53, it says, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took on our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And the punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. When we feel alone, he is with us. But with that grace comes a challenge. Who are we going to look for in our lives? To whom are we asking the question, where are you? Do we know if the people around us are struggling with depression, anxiety, with substance use problems, with other forms of addictions, with shame, with self-worth, how they've been coping in lockdown, what's weighing on their hearts and minds, how they're struggling with body image? Are we advocates for breaking down the walls that people have put up and shining light into the darkest parts of their lives? We don't all have to be psychologists. We can provide support in many different ways: emotional, practical, financial, and social. But just as we've been shown the ultimate example of what it means to reach out by Christ when he came searching for us while we were lost, we can begin to be examples of what it means to reach out to others. When we start to tear down these high places, that's when the God that we serve will likely become the God of the next generation too. But it all takes starting with the willingness to go and search out someone in need and just ask them that simple question. Where are you? How are you going? Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you that when we were lost and we were suffering, that you came down and you died for us. That you didn't leave us. You didn't leave us in that shame. You didn't come to accuse us, but instead you came and you said, I'm going to be the solution in your life. May we take that same attitude as we go forward, and may we become champions to break down the high places, the stigma around mental health, that we can reach out to others that are in need. I pray all these things in your name. Amen.